You know, most of us go through life thinking that the things that happen to us, be it for bad or for good, are purely random. That we go through life and experiencing setbacks and hardships, thinking that it's just a fluke that those things occur. But is it really random? Or is there some divine orchestration to our lives that does make sense and does have a purpose? You know, when you and I go to the movie theaters, we tend to pick stories that we know will evoke the greatest emotional response from within us. We want to see love stories that capture our hearts, that sweep us away. We want to see action-adventure movies that put us on the edges of our seats. We want to see the forces of evil mounting up against the forces of good, against all odds. We want to see victories out of that scenario. The screenwriters who create those stories are seeking to evoke the greatest possible response from us when we go. I believe that there is a divine orchestration to the story of your life. That the bad things that happen, the tragedies, the setbacks, the hardships, and even the things that are wonderful, the joy-filled moments of life that just make it worth living, are all things that are orchestrated by the great storyteller himself. For the next few weeks, we're going to look at the power of your story. Your story has the potential not just to transform you, but it has the capability to serve a greater purpose, God's purpose for your life, and to impact the lives of other people around you. So for the next few weeks, gather your friends together in an intimate living room just as we're doing here. Grab your popcorn and get ready to step in to the power of your story. Well, welcome all of you to The Power of Your Story. Really excited about this series of conversations with you. And Chris knows everybody here well enough that I think he would be great to make the introductions. Chris, I'm going to let you.
Well, the reason I'm here is because, Ben, when you asked me to be a part of it, you told me who was going to be in this circle. So to get to have friends like Pete Wilson, most people think he's just an actor and a model. He's a handsome guy who's been in a Taylor Swift video, but some may not know he's the pastor of Crosspoint here in Nashville. Have written some books and things that are really influential for me, and to be in the conversation with Pete is really an honor. Leonard Sweet has been an influence on me since my earliest years. I pastored and planted my first church when I was 23 and had read just a few books by guys like Leslie Newbegin and others, so much so that I was a little bit dangerous out there. And when I got to hear Len teach for the first time, I instantly knew this is somebody that can help point me on the right path. And he's a thought leader and a theologian and someone I have just great respect for. And Ginny provides kind of the balance and beauty that we desperately need in this room, and the perspective of an artist who is not just a singer and a songwriter. We love, she's gifted us with many great melodies, but I think more than that, Jenny's music is best experienced live. And so if anybody's had the opportunity, they know that when you go to one of Jenny's shows, you get to know her heart and who she is. She shares her story quite naturally through her music and her words. So I'm just excited that we get to be in the conversation and talk about wherever you want to take us.
I want to talk about backstory first. You know, backstory is everything that takes place before the story that is being told. And I'm not so sure many people know that they have a backstory. They live their lives clueless about that, but yet it impacts them so deeply. It affects who they are. Talk to me about people that you know, or maybe yourself. How does backstory come into play? How have you seen that lived out in people's lives?
I think one of the hardest things to get people to understand is that every story has a backstory, and to look for that backstory. And if you don't get the backstory, you're not getting the whole story. And I mean, just talk about David. I mean, you start with the story of Bethlehem, all right? Well, so you immediately go then, okay, what's the backstory of Bethlehem? There is a backstory, and David's part of that backstory. A great example there is, I mean, the word Bethlehem, we all know means, in Hebrew, place of bread, house of bread. But you keep pushing the backstory. In Arabic, it means house of meat. Wow. Well, wait a minute. So then you push the backstory further. You know, what is it? Okay, it means house of, why is it called house of bread in Hebrew, but house of meat in Arabic? Well, what grows on the fields of Bethlehem? Well, house of bread means wheat and barley. Well, wait a minute. Well, what also grows on there are other fields of Bethlehem where other things grow. Where did David tend his sheep? Yeah. Oh, so there's sheep on it. Well, what were those sheep for? Well, how far is Bethlehem from Jerusalem? Just a few miles. Oh, those were special kinds of sheep. They were sheep meant for the temple. So you start unraveling, we don't have time to do that today, but you start unraveling the backstory of Jesus' birth, and people don't know the story. They literally do not know the story of Jesus' birth because they don't know that backstory of these were sheep that were grown there, special kinds of shepherds. Basically, the temple outsourced it's a slaughterhouse. It's a house of blood. That was the other thing. You got house of bread, house of blood. You know where I'm going with this, right? I mean, the ultimate lamb. I mean, we could go on here, but this is just, you've got to always look at what's the backstory. Whatever the story is, what's the backstory?
Yeah, and we tend to lack an understanding of our backstory because we've stepped out of this oral tradition where families passed on these very things you talked about. And so for many of us, we're in therapy, we're in so many places, we're studying genealogy, so we can try to unmine and uncover things that historically were just passed down from family to generation after generation. And some of our emptiness probably in this world is rooted in the fact that we don't understand our backstory and where we've come. Now the great thing is, some of our backstory is found in the scriptures itself. We can begin to engage and find out better who we are and who we're made to be. But it's a challenge. We now have to mine for and work for what would have been passed down much more easily.
I think you're exactly right, because we don't connect the dots to the backstory and the past, and we want to be all about the future. You know, all about I want this. You know, I want my relationships to look like this. I want my career to look like this. But then there's this backstory where there is pain and there's hurt and there's sin, and if you don't learn to find a place to transform that pain, you're just going to transfer the pain. So then you transfer the pain to this relationship, you know, and it just carries on and on and on into each chapter. And we fail to connect those dots and find a way that some of that backstory that needs to be redeemed, you know, can be redeemed.
Yeah. Yeah, those are informing these future decisions in ways we don't realize.
Exactly.
So we're constantly sabotaging ourselves by not knowing or understanding.
Right. There are parts of our backstory that we need to, by the grace of God and by the Spirit of God in our lives, break from, and to set afresh and anew God's destiny for us and our future. We have to break from that. I remember I grew up, my parents, wonderful people, they grew up in some really difficult circumstances, and that was brought to bear in our family. And so there were many years I tried to live my life in the context of really how they ran our household, which conflicted with probably who I was as a person. And so by my college years, there was a tremendous amount of conflict. I remember when I finally decided to go after what I knew God had for me, and it involved driving and moving and leaving for the last time Ohio to drive to Virginia, and I cried the entire way there. Not tears of sadness, but more tears of joy that I was able to finally break from the negative parts of my backstory and go forward fresh. But there have been parts of my life where I need to claim. There's a destiny that I've wakened to that God has called me to. I know one of my ancestors is the Scottish poet Robert Burns, and having someone like that in your history, it emboldens you when you write. You have to live to a higher standard, you know. And I have not come close to meeting that, but it's a part of my backstory that gives me more courage as I approach writing projects. And I think backstory can be a curse, it can be a blessing, but it's not anything that is meant to hinder the life story God has for us.
Too often we live as though we're people that are autonomous. We kind of come out of nowhere. But the truth is, every one of us has a backstory. In fact, one of the reasons that many of us end up in counseling or therapy is that we have to basically pay someone to help us make sense of our backstory, to figure out where we've come from. And the truth is, if you read the Bible well, you're really reading the Bible to discern your own backstory. It's not just a book of information. If you read it only for information, to find out facts about the world, you're not reading the Bible well. In fact, too many Christians have fallen into that trap, and they begin to load their brain on information, and it doesn't serve us well. In fact, if you find yourself reading the Bible and often thinking, wow, this is going to be really helpful because it proves how right I am, or when I read this, it's going to help me in my argument about theology with somebody else. People really don't like you. I hate to break it to you, but nobody likes you. Your mother doesn't like you. You're really hard to be around. When you read the Bible well, you're reading it to discern your story, to figure out who you are. You hear about Adam and Eve in the garden and how they were created in paradise, and yet they blow the whole thing up. They mess it up on their own accord. And you begin to realize, that's who I am. That's what I do. I mess things up. The best way I can explain it as I think about my own story, I got to do a book years ago with my dad and my grandfather, who were both Baptist pastors. My dad has really lost his line of the family. So his dad died in the Korean War when he was 6 weeks old. His mom died when he was a young boy. He was raised by his grandparents that I only knew for a very short time. His grandfather was a guy named Pappy, and it took me a long time to realize that Pappy was a really important influence in my life, though I only knew him for a short time. My Pappy was a one-armed truck driver. So not many people know one-armed truck drivers, but when you're a little kid, my experience with him was sitting in his lap on the porch and being so young that I didn't quite have the words, right? And I remember sitting there kind of flapping around his stub of an arm. And I was so impressed because he drove a dump truck, which as a 4-year-old is about the coolest thing you could find. And I remember finally having the words to say, Pappy, where is your arm? Right? What happened to your arm? And even as a young kid, it became really clear this is not a story that our family told, that nobody talked about it. So it wasn't until I was an adult we finally pursued my aunt's sister. I don't really know her name. We just called her Aunt Sister. And asked, what was the story? How did Pappy lose his arm? And finally, I hear the story that my Pappy was in a bar very close to where I live in Houston. And he saw the way that a man was treating a woman in that bar, and he didn't like it. He let him know, it's not how you treat a woman. They got in a fight, and my Pappy whoops this guy, thinks the fight is over, but this guy goes out to a truck. He brings in a gun, and he shoots my Pappy's arm off in the bar. Which already, I thought it was like a train accident or something. I was shocked, but my Pappy then, with his good arm, he picks this guy up, he throws him against a wall, and he kills him. Now, when I heard this story, it's not what I was expecting at all. And I wasn't really fully able to process it. In fact, I realized it took me a while to even tell my wife the story. And it took me maybe years to really figure out that story wasn't just an interesting story about what happened in a bar literally on Mid Lane in Houston, right where I used to live. But that it really was my story. That, in fact, one of the reasons I didn't go home and tell my wife that story is because I've inherited from my Pappy to my dad to me this tendency to when big things happen to close up about them. My Pappy never spoke about that event to anybody. He did his job. He's a really faithful guy. He sat on the porch, but he didn't speak about anything emotional, anything really challenging. And he was the major influence on my dad, the male role model for my dad. Nobody shaped me more than my dad. And I realized that this story affects whether I go home and talk to my wife about something or don't. I'm a person with a backstory. You're a person with a backstory. And when we begin to understand where we've come from, we're better equipped to really figure out where we're going, where we're called to go. My hope is that you'll learn more about your backstory, and that when you do, you'll be ready to move forward.